One of the things I love most about the motorcycle industry, as opposed to, say, the car or, I don't know, the light bulb industry, is that every now and then a trend will come along, one that on many levels really doesn't make a whole lot of financial sense, and yet a whole bunch of manufacturers will jump on board and be like, yeah, this is the thing we should be investing millions into. Think automatic transmission motorcycles, or the sort of covered car motorcycle hybrids, or large displacement scooters made for touring. Okay, people actually like those. Now, it's true that today the bean counters have officially taken over, and even those manufacturers that once were known for taking risks, many are too afraid to dive in on something new and different. In some ways, Kawasaki actually stands alone with bikes like the H2 and, of course, robotic horses. But that wasn't the case back in the 90s, when for some strange reason, all of the big four Japanese manufacturers dove headfirst into the design and development of tiny, small displacement, super high-revving sport bikes. Alright guys, I've got to tell you about this amazing app called Upside, which is the sponsor for this video. This is such an easy, simple way to get real cash back buying things that you already need, things like gas and groceries. People can earn 3 times more cash back with Upside than any other product. This includes loyalty programs and credit card rewards. On average, Upside users are getting as much as $280 back per year, and that money could go towards your motorcycle insurance premiums or fuel or a new helmet. So let me show you how it works. It's so simple. There are over 100,000 gas stations, grocery stores, and restaurants in the app. So all you have to do is just download the free Upside app and jump in. Creating an account takes literally seconds. Get your debit or credit card info into the app, and then start claiming rewards. So here, for example, I'm looking at a gas station because we're low on gas, and you can see all these offers in our area. All you have to do is claim the offer and go pay for your gas with that same payment type that you've put into the app. It's so simple. Honestly, I love this, guys, and again, it's not just gas. You can use this for restaurants and groceries. And what I love is just how simple and easy this is to use. There's no confusing reward system. It's just real cash back. Now, I've partnered with Upside to get you guys a special offer, so click on the link in the description to download Upside and use code BART Motorcycle to get an extra 25 cents back on every gallon of gas for your first tank of gas. So again, big shout out to Upside, and I hope you guys really enjoy using this. It's really awesome. And let's jump back into the video. The 90s was in many ways a perfect storm for Japanese manufacturers to start doing truly outlandish things with their motorcycles. On the larger displacement end, of course, we saw the rise of the modern high-revving sport bike and even superbike and hyperbike. Motorcycle manufacturers began implementing superchargers and turbochargers and USB chargers. Okay, no USB chargers. Sport bike purists might say that this era was kind of the peak of motorcycle development. There was every level of power you could ever want on tap without so many of the technological advancements that kind of get in the way and did lame things like, potentially save your life. In many ways, motorcycle racing was also the main force driving development. Regular riders wanted bikes that were as close as possible to the bikes that they witnessed on Sunday, but there was a problem. A production equivalent of, say, Honda's RC30 or even their 500cc Grand Prix bike was not easily accessible for most riders in Japan at this time. In fact, owning and riding any sport bike that was over 400 cc's was almost impossible. Let me explain. At the heart of the issue was Japan's tiered motorcycle licensing system, which categorized riders according to the displacement and power of the motorcycles they were legally permitted to operate. This system was designed with safety, accessibility, and also skill progression in mind, similar to how it is in the UK. But it had significant unintended consequences on motorcycle design and also consumer behavior, especially for those wanting to own bikes over 400 cc's. The system was divided into several key classes. There was the small motorcycle license, which allowed operation of bikes under 125 cc's. Then there was the ordinary motorcycle license, which permitted operation of bikes between 125 and 400. And then there was the large motorcycle license, which was required if you wanted to ride a bike over 400 cc's. While these categories seem pretty simple on paper, the difficulty in acquiring, say, a large motorcycle license was a major barrier. To get this license, riders were required to undergo training and testing at specific certified driving schools, which could be, really costly and time consuming. In many cases, riders attempting to pass the practical test without attending one of these schools had incredibly high failure rates, and this made large displacement motorcycles not only less accessible in terms of skill and readiness, but also less financially viable for many young or casual riders. It just wasn't like the way it is here in America where any new rider can go buy a leader bike. Even if you could obtain one of these large displacement licenses, the taxes and inspections and insurance premiums for these bikes was so expensive, and so most Japanese riders, regardless of skill level, simply stayed within the 400cc limit, where the whole process of getting and owning a bike was just way more manageable and affordable. Now, of course, none of this applied to the West, and so the Japanese manufacturers carried on making massive, powerful bikes, primarily for other international markets. But these domestic regulations and hurdles meant that for their home market in Japan, they would need to develop specific kinds of motorcycles to sort of cure that itch for sporty enthusiasts, which, thanks to, these companies' success in racing, was virtually everybody. And unlike so many other manufacturers from other parts of the world, Japanese manufacturers have and still today really care about their domestic market and catering to their domestic market, which I think is pretty cool. Now, it wasn't as though the Japanese manufacturers had never made small displacement sporty motorcycles. In the 70s, small two-strokes dominated this part of the market. In the mid-80s, bikes like the CBR250R and the FZR250R were, competent small sport bikes, but it all started to get crazy when Yamaha decided to develop this bike, the FZR250. The goal with this motorcycle was to approach the 250cc class from a new perspective. What if, instead of constantly making concessions with these smaller bikes, what if you could go all in with production race bike tech crammed into this small platform? Or even further, what if the 250cc class could sort of function as a testing ground for what's possible on a production motorcycle? The FZR250 was kind of an evolution of the Phaser from a few years earlier with its revolutionary Genesis design concept. The Genesis concept was kind of a holistic approach to sport bike development, centered around the bike being compact and having really good mass centralization, also high RPM breathing and lightweight rigidity. Some early Genesis models even had 5 valves per cylinder. Still, Yamaha managed to make the little engine rev to 17,000 RPM. Unbelievable numbers, not just for this time. Formula One cars weren't even in this realm. To reach high RPMs, the FZR250's engine had to be incredibly lightweight and have low internal friction. Yamaha used lightweight materials in key components like the pistons and valves and crankshaft. These components were designed to minimize mass and to make it easier for the engine to reach higher revolutions without overloading or stressing the engine. Now, one of the key elements of this system was the angle at which the engine sat, namely more leaned forward, and this made it so that Yamaha could utilize something called FAI, or fresh air intake. In essence, this was Yamaha's early system for routing cool external air directly to the engine's airbox to improve engine breathing, especially at high RPMs. This was all race bike tech for production. Advanced valve timing allowed the engine to produce high power at higher RPMs rather than relying on torque at lower RPM. It wasn't just the engine though, the entire bike, from the lightweight aluminum delta box frame to the fully faired aerodynamic body, the suspension, everything, it all pointed to one thing: raw race bike performance with a mere 45 horsepower. Though revs were the name of the game for these bikes, the FCR would stand out as the single lightest bike of this bunch. Now, at about the same time, Honda was cooking up their own high-revving 250cc sport bike, a platform that would take this whole idea of high-revving inline 4 to another level. Shortly after the release of Yamaha's 250cc FZR, Honda would bring to market a motorcycle that really defied the expectations of what a small displacement machine could be, the CBR250F, also known as the CBR250-4. Now, it wasn't just another entry into the crowded Japanese 250cc class, it also was a high-revving, high-tech marvel that brought Honda's superbike engineering to an engine smaller than a 2-slice toaster. This bike didn't merely hint at Honda's engineering prowess, it screamed it, quite literally. Just take a listen. The heart of the CBR250F was its tiny jewel of an engine, a 249cc liquid-cooled inline-4 equipped with double overhead cams and 4 valves per cylinder. Achieving this high a number of RPMs was more than just increasing, redline numbers. It meant completely rethinking how components behaved at microscopic tolerances. To rev safely and reliably at 18K, Honda engineers had to create this perfect balance, this perfect combination of lightweight, ultra-precise internal components, but also stuff that was durable. So they used forged pistons and mainly the short stroke dimensions, which allowed the engine to spin faster without excessive piston speed. And as many of you know, this is a key in high-rev engine design. Honda's experience in Grand Prix racing and making incredibly high-revving multi-cylinder machines from decades before this actually fed directly into this project. To keep friction and heat under control, high-quality materials and these narrow tolerances were matched with a finely tuned liquid-cooled system that ensured thermal stability even when the bike was pushed to its limits. Perhaps the single most important and distinctive element of Honda's iteration of the 250cc Screamer was its use of gear-driven cams, and that was taken straight from their Grand Prix programs. And this whole system is the reason why, a bit later on, Honda would make probably the best version in the world of this kind of motorcycle in the MC22. But the CBR250F wasn't just an engine strapped to a frame. The chassis was equally sophisticated with its twin beam aluminum frame. It was torsionally stiff and compact, and it gave the bike incredible handling characteristics. Paired with a monoshock rear and telescopic forks up front, the CBR250F gave riders quick steering and sharp agility that really matched with the engine. The combination of high revving output and this tight chassis design meant that the CBR250F just felt alive, especially in the upper half of the tachometer. And if you've ridden a high revving inline 4 that hits its limiter at say 13, 14K, this thing was still singing at like 18K. There was so much technology and refinement compressed into this small, seemingly modest little sport bike. It didn't just borrow ideas from larger Honda sport bikes. In many ways, it kind of led to them, especially in how Honda approached engine precision and this power to displacement efficiency. The bike produced the maximum 45 horsepower, but how it delivered that power, so smoothly and cleanly is what really set it apart from this crop of bikes. Now at this point the race was on. Who of the Japanese manufacturers could make the best 250cc road legal race bike? And what would make these specific manufacturer models distinct? Yamaha and Honda had kicked things off, but now Suzuki wanted in on the action, and so they made the now iconic GSXR250. Suzuki had already made its mark on the sport bike world, of course with the introduction of the GSXR750, an ultra-light, track-focused motorcycle that redefined the middleweight sport bike category. That bike wasn't just fast, it was purpose-built with an aluminum frame designed with racing in mind. When Suzuki turned its attention to the 250cc segment, it really aimed at bringing that same ethos into the smallest sport bike category. The GSXR250 was launched in 1987 as a direct competitor to the CBR250F and Yamaha's FZR250, and like its rivals, it had a liquid-cooled inline 4 16-valve engine capable of spinning also up to 18K on the tachometer. But Suzuki's design choices, both aesthetically and mechanically, are really what made it stand out. First off, this engine was able to get to its high rev ceiling by having an ultra short stroke configuration, 44 by 30 millimeters, which allowed the pistons to travel shorter distances and therefore spin safely. The way that this bike delivered its power was a bit different than Honda. It was quintessentially Suzuki. It was peaky and just like thrilling at the top end. To manage valve flow and friction at such high RPMs, the GSXR250 used lightweight components throughout the top end. Unlike the GSXR750, which was air and oil cooled, this was fully liquid cooled. Visually, it was also unmistakably GSXR. The dual round headlights, the full fairing, that slab-sided bodywork echoed the GSXR 750 and also the GSXR 1100 from this same era. For riders who couldn't afford or legally ride those bigger bikes, this 250 gave them an authentic slice of that Suzuki sport bike identity right down to the iconic blue and white livery. Now, unlike some of its rivals, the GSXR 250 was never sold widely outside of Japan and it remained a niche product even domestically. Production ran from 87 through about 1990, followed by the short-lived GSXR250R, which brought some minor updates. But I would say out of all of these bikes, the Suzuki is probably the one that sold the least, despite it being one of the coolest. Now, if you're counting, you might realize that at this point, there's one Japanese player who hasn't jumped in on this style of motorcycle. And mind you, the 80s were coming to a close. Yamaha and Honda and Suzuki all had bikes for a few years, but in 1989, Kawasaki dove in with their ZXR250, the Baby Ninja. This motorcycle was much like the others in that it was big bike tech brought to the smaller class. It looked perhaps more than any other bike like a full-sized sport bike replica of its bigger Ninja brothers, but Kawasaki decided to go a step further, tuning the 4-valve inline-4 for even higher revs with about 10% less torque, with a redline now starting at 19K. These motorcycles from the 80s, they were all truly marvels of engineering, but it would be Honda that would create the ultimate high-revving machine in the form of the MC22. Now, if you're just comparing tachometers, a later version of the Baby Ninja would actually have the highest technical redline, but 19K is really where they all stood. For the CBR250RR or MC22, it was the whole package that really made it stand out. It was the way it revved, it was the refinement, the power, and just that smooth Honda nature. The CBR250RR had a new box section aluminum twin spar frame that would give the bike incredible handling. The gear-driven high-revving engine would prove the most reliable of all of these high-revving bikes. I mean, owners will tell you the tach goes all the way to 21K, and these bikes can go there without exploding. I mean, just think about that. A production motorcycle revving past 20,000 RPM. It was entirely over-engineered and it looked the part, more modern in terms of sport bike styling than the competitors, and because of this, it would go on to be the best-selling of the whole bunch. Now, the golden age of the 250cc high-revving Japanese bikes really coincided with Japan's economic bubble of the late 80s. At the time, domestic demand for motorcycles was strong. Manufacturers responded with this kind of arms race, pouring cutting-edge technology into every class of motorcycle, but especially these tiny sport bikes. But with the collapse of Japan's bubble economy in the early 90s, the entire financial landscape changed. Consumers' spending shrank, high-cost, high-complexity motorcycles, especially those with a relatively niche appeal, just became less viable to produce. Despite their size, these 250cc inline 4s were not cheap to build, with gear-driven cams, in Honda's case at least, high-end suspension, aluminum frames, and just exotic engineering and design. These bikes required the same level of manufacturing precision as 600cc or even 1000cc sport bikes, but because of market perception, they had to be priced significantly lower, so the manufacturers realized that they were investing super bike level resources into machines that just had bad profit margins. Around this time also, parallel twin 250s like the Ninja 250R could be made much cheaper, they were easier to ride, and they satisfied the same licensing restrictions, all while appealing to a bigger global market. Now, of course, these twins didn't offer the same level of performance, but they just made more financial sense at this point. Also, as the 90s wore on, emissions and also noise regulations tightened both in Japan and globally, and so high-revving four-cylinder engines, by their nature, they produce more exhaust and noise per cubic centimeter, so meeting new standards would have required even more investment into things like fuel injection and catalytic converters and even noise dampening systems, which would really kind of kill the whole vibe of these bikes. While these 250cc 4s were really loved by enthusiasts, and they still are, especially in places like New Zealand and Australia where Honda dumped all their leftover stuff from these bikes, they just didn't always make a lot of sense for the average rider. They made their power really high in the rev range, they required constant gear changes to stay in that power band, and they lacked low-end torque for normal city riding or commuting. By the early 2000s, Kawasaki's Ninja 250R and Honda's CBR250R dominated the beginner and commuter segments globally. These machines were engineered more for usability, not maximum performance, and they were better aligned with the needs of modern riders. Enthusiasts were still around, but they were now more likely to go buy a used MC22 or move up to a 600. The High-Revving 250cc inline-4 sport bike was a product of a very specific time and place, this booming Japanese economy, and also these restrictive licensing laws. And I would also say just kind of a culture of engineering bravado among the Japanese manufacturers and just fierce rivalry between them. These bikes were and remain some of the greatest mechanical masterpieces in motorcycle history. Today these bikes are loved by collectors and enthusiasts as kind of symbols of an era when the motorcycle industry dared to build ridiculous machines without compromises, even in the smallest packages. In 2022, Kawasaki made a rather bold move by bringing back this spirit with the ZX25R, the same 250cc inline-4 formula, revving almost as high as the original Baby Ninja, but now in a thoroughly modern package with modern emissions compliances and things like quick shifters and ride-by-wire throttle. Then there's the ZX4RR, which is the 400cc version, revving all the way to 16K and making 77 horsepower. Now, I've talked quite a bit about Kawasaki and just their overall approach to motorcycles. It's important to understand that Kawasaki stands out among the Japanese manufacturers in that motorcycles don't make up a very large portion of their revenue, and so they're much more willing to just have fun with motorcycles and take risks. This is why they can develop a bike like the H2 in tandem with completely refreshing the W800. I mean, these bikes couldn't be further from each other, and yet Kawasaki makes both for entirely different but similarly limited niche groups. Now, I would love to see Kawasaki's making of these high-revving small inline fours just sort of spur on a resurgence of fun, interesting, wild, small displacement bikes. It'd be really cool if Honda brought back the original 250cc or 400cc baby blades, but I doubt that will happen. But we'll see. I hope you guys enjoyed this look at one of the stranger but also funner moments in motorcycle history. We'll see you guys in the next one. Ride safe.